This is an interesting scene in the life of St. Paul. It's almost funny how it happens. And every time I encounter it in the readings, how the people rush out and they immediately want to offer sacrifices and oblations to Paul and to Barnabas. I think, I've been in Ridley Park for 10 months and not one person has offered a sacrifice to me. What's happening here and what can we take away from it? So Paul and Barnabas, they're on mission. They leave. There's a few things I want to focus on. They leave Iconium because they perceive that there's this mounting threat against them and that they want to put them to death. That's really interesting because Paul is very willing to die. So the fact that he actually avoids his own death is worth noting. The second thing I want to mention is that expression when Paul and Barnabas see this guy that they end up healing, it says he looks intently at him. And Luke, in his writings, that's a phrase that only Luke uses. So that's another point of interest for us. And then the last thing is Paul's response to the crowds who want to offer this sacrifice and how strong his response is. So what's happening here is that Paul and Barnabas, they're on mission. They are servants of the Lord. They understand their identity is those who have been sent. That's what the word apostle means. It just means sent. The message they carry is not theirs. The mission that they're following, they did not prescribe themselves. This is all coming from God. They are living out very deeply that mindset of Jesus who says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And so their entire apostolate is founded on this basis that they are nothing apart from Jesus. Jesus is all. In fact, in so much of Paul's New Testament letters, he will write about his own sins, how awful he was, because he probably was so well esteemed that he just lived in his wretchedness as a reminder that anything that he may have become, it is purely by God's grace. And so off he goes. So we see the evidence in those 3 checkpoints because while he's very willing to die for God, that has to be in God's time. And in his own discernment, that time has not yet come in Iconium. And he's not here for his own glory. So he actually avoids martyrdom in obedience to the divine impulse. In the same way that our Lord would say, my hour has not yet come. So in the various times that they tried to stone him, that wasn't the moment. So he evaded and he traveled through the crowds. And so Paul is doing similar things. But then we get to this, he looks intently at him. When Luke says this, it's typically a precedent for divine activity. So what's happening is Paul in this moment is perceiving God inviting him to do something, to act and respond to this situation. And so Paul does. And the result is this miracle. But again, we're seeing the docility of Paul, whose whole purpose is simply to please the will of the Father. And then the response gets wildly and very quickly out of control, and they try to rush and offer sacrifices to him. They call him Zeus and Hermes. Well, they call Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes because Hermes was the speaker and Paul's doing all of the preaching, so they think he's Hermes. And they're treating them as gods. Now, it takes a pretty strong person not to accept that level of esteem. And yet Paul and Barnabas' response is they rip their garments. This is them radically separating themselves from what is happening right now. This is the Jewish response of absolute offense, outrage to the deepest level. There's no stronger gesture in Jewish culture than to rend your garments like that. So they are absolutely divorcing themselves from what is happening in front of them. And then it says they rush into the crowd. They don't hesitate for a second to renounce this thing that the people are trying to do, this pedestal they're trying to put them on, this worship that they're starting to offer. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What does that say for us? If we really are to be disciples, and disciples are not greater than their masters, then this level of personal self-emptiness also has to be a priority in our own spiritual life. I know in the seminary, when they're preparing men to become ordained ministers who will proclaim the word, you know what they dedicate most of the time toward? Human formation. Because all this humanity very quickly gets in the way of the mission. So that if I have unresolved resentments, maybe I have trauma that isn't yet healed. If I have a short fuse and I get quick to anger, if my chastity is in ruins, then what gospel can I preach? And what face of Christ will people encounter in me, wherever it is that God sends me? They're going to encounter the gospel of Sean Loomis, and it's going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess. And the church, knowing that, invests in her men so that their humanity is what becomes an oblation to Christ, and that Christ is what becomes fully alive in them. And in the spiritual life, that's the same principle by which we need to live, whether it's in the vineyard of the Lord of our marriage, of our job, of our neighborhood and community where we are planted, of our motherhood and fatherhood, all of those arenas, we are sent to be apostles to proclaim a gospel that our humanity, in all of its brokenness, is daily trying to sabotage. Mine is, all the time. But to the extent that we allow that, we indulge the flesh, we entertain vices, we tolerate character defects, then our mission is going to suffer. Not that we're ever going to perfectly eradicate it, but to the extent that we can, we should be striving all the time to empty ourselves before God, to get rid of self-will, so that, like St. Paul, we too can say, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So that when I go out, it is Christ's gospel that I preach, and it is Jesus Christ whom the world meets.